She's not dead. A black homeless stops billionaire's funeral. What happened next shocked everyone. Marcus Reynolds was once the kind of man who walked into glass towers with his head held high. A gifted software architect, he built systems that powered corporations, shaping the invisible lines of code that kept billion-dollar empires running. He had a corner office, a car that gleamed like polished steel, and a quiet pride that he had climbed from nothing to make a place for himself in San Francisco's unforgiving world. But life, especially for a black man trying to survive in rooms where power was inherited, had a way of stripping dignity piece by piece. Years earlier, a scandal Marcus didn't create swallowed his career. False accusations of fraud, paperwork twisted, signatures forged, and numbers manipulated were pinned on him. He pleaded his innocence, but in boardrooms where his word carried less weight than those born into wealth, truth became disposable. The fallout was devastating. He lost his job, his reputation, and with it, his home. From a respected architect of technology, Marcus fell into the shadows of the city he once helped shape. Nights were spent under freeway bridges, his belongings reduced to a weathered backpack and a cracked phone he refused to part with. That phone carried the only piece of evidence he'd ever managed to capture, the faint thread of a truth too dangerous to be ignored. Life on the streets hardened him but never broke him. He moved silently through alleyways, slept near missions, and watched the towers of wealth sparkle above him as a cruel reminder of how quickly society erases those it no longer finds useful. People averted their eyes when he passed. Some clutched their bags tighter. Others muttered under their breath, as if his presence itself was an inconvenience. Yet Marcus carried himself with a quiet fire, the kind that comes from knowing you've been buried alive but still breathing. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share a word of love in the comments. And somewhere, beneath the loneliness and hunger, he nurtured an unshakable resolve. He knew what had been done to him wasn't just corporate betrayal. It was personal. It had names, faces, and fingerprints. One of those names carried enormous weight. Charles Whitmore, the powerful billionaire husband of Eleanor Whitmore, San Francisco's real estate queen. Charles had been the man who framed him, and Marcus never forgot it. Eleanor herself was a figure larger than life. Elegant, commanding, and fiercely intelligent. She had turned her family's holdings into a coastal empire of glass towers, luxury condos, and sprawling estates. Her name was synonymous with power. To most, she was untouchable, a symbol of wealth at its most dazzling. And yet, in death, or what the world believed to be death, she became the stage for a truth far darker than any Fortune magazine cover could reveal. When the news broke that Eleanor Whitmore had suddenly passed, the city mourned. Newspapers ran with headlines about her unexpected heart failure. Her platinum casket was ordered within hours. Politicians, celebrities, and tycoons flew in from across the country to attend the funeral. Television networks set up their cameras to capture the grand farewell of one of the West Coast's richest women. For the elite, it was a moment to be seen, a performance of grief dressed in tailored suits and black gowns. But for Marcus, watching from the margins of the city, something about her death struck him differently. He had been following Charles Whitmore for years, collecting scraps of evidence that others ignored. Late-night conversations overheard in parking lots, suspicious financial trails, and coded purchases hidden in dark web transactions. All of it pointed to something far larger than simple corruption. When he learned of Eleanor's sudden death, the timing was too perfect. And in Marcus's gut, the same gut that had been sharpened by betrayal and survival, he knew this was no accident. His life had taught him a brutal lesson. In a world stacked against him, justice never came neatly packaged. You had to claw for it. You had to risk humiliation, danger, and even your own freedom to drag the truth into the light. That phone he carried, cracked and battered from years of survival, still held a recording that could rip through the polished fabric of power. It was dangerous, but it was all he had left. In the days leading up to Eleanor's funeral, Marcus found himself haunted by a choice. He could stay silent, as so many expected of him, blending back into the faceless crowd of the forgotten. Or he could risk everything, his safety, his dignity, even the little life he still clung to, by stepping forward in front of the world. The city moved quickly to prepare for the funeral. Streets around the cemetery were blocked off, and black SUVs lined the roads. The guest list was stacked with names that controlled banks, corporations, and political offices. To the cameras, it looked like the gathering of royalty. But behind the gleaming casket and velvet ropes lay a secret ready to erupt. Marcus knew he didn't belong there. He knew the crowd would see only a homeless man, someone to be dismissed, mocked, or dragged away. But he also knew something else. Sometimes the people with the least to lose are the ones willing to risk it all. As the morning of the funeral arrived, Marcus stood at the edge of the city, rain-soaked and shivering, staring at the black procession rolling toward the cemetery. He clenched his phone in his hand and whispered to himself the words that carried him through years of silence. They tried to bury me once. Not again. What he didn't know was that by stepping forward, he wouldn't just change the course of one funeral. He would alter the lives of everyone standing there, and he would challenge the very idea of truth in a world built to silence him. The morning of Eleanor Whitmore's funeral broke gray and heavy, the kind of sky that seemed to press down on the city itself. At the gates of the cemetery, black cars glided in one after another, each carrying a figure of influence. Politicians, tycoons, celebrities, even judges in dark coats. Cameras tracked every step, microphones caught every whisper, and the polished casket gleamed like a mirror of power. On the outer edges of the crowd stood Marcus Reynolds. His coat was torn, his shoes worn thin, but his eyes carried a weight far greater than anything the mourners wore. He didn't just come to watch. He came carrying the one thing no one else dared bring into that sacred display of wealth: the truth. As the casket was lowered and the priest's words rose in solemn cadence, Marcus felt his chest tighten. He knew this was the moment. If he failed, Eleanor would be gone forever, and with her the chance to expose Charles Whitmore. If he succeeded, he might not live to see the end of it. When he stepped forward, the air shifted. People turned, some frowning, others confused. And then his voice, the crowd erupted. Gasps, murmurs, and even laughter rippled through the mourners. To them, he was an intruder, a homeless man daring to invade their world of order and grief. Security rushed forward, grabbing at his arms, but Marcus didn't stop. He shouted louder, forcing every camera and every lens to turn his way. He declared that Eleanor had been poisoned with a toxin designed to mimic death. He named Charles Whitmore and Dr. Langston as the men responsible. The crowd froze. For a moment, disbelief hung heavy. But disbelief quickly gave way to discomfort, then anger. Whispers spread, cameras zoomed in, and suddenly, the neatly scripted performance of power was unraveling. Security tried dragging him away, but Marcus planted his feet in the dirt. "I have proof," he cried out, holding up his battered phone. With trembling fingers, he pulled up an old recording. Voices filled the cemetery, echoing from the phone's small speaker. Charles Whitmore and Dr. Langston, discussing dosage, timing, and the perfect window to make a death appear natural. Gasps turned to shouts. Some mourners backed away in horror. Others pulled out their own phones, recording, live streaming, amplifying the moment beyond the cemetery gates. Marcus had forced the world to listen. But the danger was immediate. Charles Whitmore's face twisted in fury. He barked at security to silence Marcus, his voice cracking with authority. Cameras caught every gesture, every flash of rage, and in that moment, suspicion became something darker. Marcus pushed harder. He explained the toxin, saxitoxin, a rare neurotoxin that paralyzed the body into a state so close to death that even doctors could be fooled. He told them Eleanor still had a chance if the antidote was given. But time was running out. The air grew electric. Then, from the crowd, a new voice cut through. Eleanor's aunt, Margaret Hollingsworth, a woman whose influence carried nearly as much weight as Eleanor herself. She stepped forward, declaring that if there was even a chance Marcus was right, they had a duty to act. Her words ignited the crowd's uncertainty into urgency. And then came another blow to Charles's control. Dr. Veronica Clark, a toxicology expert from the Department of Justice, stepped into the open. She confirmed she had been working with Marcus, quietly building a case against Charles and Dr. Langston for months. The ground beneath Charles's power began to crumble. Marcus connected his worn tablet to a projector one mourner had carried for a tribute slideshow. Instead of family photos, the screen lit up with damning evidence. Financial records, offshore accounts, doctored contracts, all pointing to Charles's theft and betrayal. The audience, once skeptical, was now transfixed. Every file on that screen peeled away the layers of his empire. And yet, the most harrowing moment was still to come. Marcus knelt beside the casket. He pulled out a small vial, the antidote. The crowd held its breath as he carefully applied drops to Eleanor's lips. The silence was unbearable. Seconds stretched into eternity. Nothing happened. Some mourners turned away, shaking their heads. A few muttered about madness, about conspiracy. Security took a step forward, ready to drag him off once and for all. Charles smirked, convinced the spectacle would collapse on itself. Then, a twitch. Eleanor's fingers trembled against the silk lining. A faint movement so small it could have been imagined. Dr. Clark rushed forward, checking her pulse, and her sharp intake of breath told the crowd what their eyes could hardly believe. A heartbeat. The silence was shattered. Screams, sobs, and shouts erupted. Cameras zoomed in as Eleanor's eyelids fluttered, her chest rising with the fragile rhythm of life. The woman they had mourned, the billionaire they had lowered into the ground, was not gone. She was alive. Panic rippled through Charles. He tried to bolt, shoving past stunned mourners. But the screech of tires cut him off. Black SUVs from the Department of Justice stormed the cemetery gates. Agents poured out, their badges flashing, their weapons drawn. Within moments, Charles and Dr. Langston were handcuffed before the very crowd they had tried to deceive. Dr. Langston broke first. Tears streaming, he confessed that Charles had threatened his family, using fear to bind him into silence. Charles, on the other hand, thrashed and spat venom, shouting promises of revenge even as cameras captured his downfall. The world was watching, and Marcus, the man they once dismissed as a broken shadow of society, now stood at the center of history's most shocking resurrection. Yet as Eleanor's weak hand gripped his, one truth burned brighter than all the cameras combined. The fight wasn't over. This was only the beginning of a battle that would shake empires, rewrite legacies, and finally expose how deep corruption could bury the innocent. But with Charles Whitmore's empire unraveling and the eyes of the nation fixed on Marcus, one question lingered in every heart. How much more danger was still waiting in the shadows? The cemetery had turned into a theater of revelation. What began as a staged farewell for the city's most powerful woman had exploded into chaos broadcast across every network. But for Marcus Reynolds, the man who had dragged truth into the light, the most dangerous storm was still ahead. The moment Eleanor's eyes fluttered open, the crowd gasped in disbelief, but Marcus's focus sharpened. He had fought for years to reach this point, but victory was never that simple. Power did not fall quietly, and men like Charles Whitmore did not accept defeat with grace. As federal agents closed in, Charles twisted, his face a mask of rage and desperation. With one violent shove, he broke from their grip and lunged toward Marcus. The crowd shrieked as the billionaire who once lived above the law clawed at the man who had destroyed his empire. For an instant, it seemed Marcus might be dragged into the dirt, beaten down before the world. But agents swarmed him, forcing Charles to the ground. His curses, venomous and loud, echoed across the cemetery. "This isn't over," he roared. His voice cracked with the fury of a man who had lost everything but still clung to arrogance like armor. Dr. Langston, trembling in cuffs beside him, broke down entirely. Tears streaked his cheeks as he shouted his confession for all to hear. He admitted to mixing the toxin, admitting to forging records, admitting to every step he took under Charles's command. And then, with shaking words, he revealed why. Charles had threatened his son's scholarship, dangling his future like a noose. The confession struck like lightning. It wasn't just corruption. It was exploitation, coercion, and cruelty. Even those who had doubted Marcus minutes earlier now saw the truth with piercing clarity. This wasn't madness. This was betrayal at the highest level. Yet for Marcus, standing before cameras and flashing lights, the moment carried more than vindication. It carried the weight of years he had spent erased, cast aside, treated as less than human. Now his voice had been heard, but the scars of silence still bled beneath the surface. He looked at Eleanor, still weak but alive, her pale hand clutching the edges of the casket as agents rushed her to safety. She was proof of everything he claimed, and still, he could feel the burn of eyes around him, the silent judgment, the suspicion that had followed him since the first day he lost everything. For a black man who had lived invisible in the cracks of society, being right was never enough. He had risked everything, and even now, some would see only a vagrant who had disturbed their ceremony. The press swarmed, shouting questions, shoving microphones at his face. "Who are you? How did you know? Why should anyone trust you?" Their voices blurred into a wall of noise, none of them realizing the cruelty of the question. Trust, for Marcus, had been stripped the moment Charles painted him as a fraud. And yet here he stood, holding evidence that brought a billionaire to his knees. The scene turned into a frenzy. DOJ agents escorted Eleanor away under medical watch, but the cameras remained fixed on Marcus. The crowd demanded answers, but so did the world watching live. And in that spotlight, Marcus felt the crushing weight of a choice. Remain silent, or use this moment to force the truth into history. He raised his phone again, showing the world what it meant to be erased. He played not just the recording of Charles and Langston, but the years of evidence he had gathered: dark web purchases, offshore accounts, forged transfers. Each file was a wound inflicted on him, but now each one became a weapon of justice. The audience in the cemetery stood stunned. Some wept openly. Others whispered about how close Eleanor had come to being buried alive. Yet in the middle of the chaos, Marcus's mind burned with something more personal. The realization that survival had never been enough. He had clawed his way through years of humiliation to reach this point, but the fight against erasure was not over. It was only beginning. As Charles was dragged into a waiting SUV, thrashing and spitting venom, he locked eyes with Marcus one last time. His voice, hoarse and broken, spat across the distance. "I'll ruin you. I'll bury you again." But Marcus, shoulders squared, did not flinch. He had been buried once, buried under lies, under prejudice, under the weight of a system designed to forget him. And yet here he stood, not just alive, but undeniable. The agents slammed the door on Charles, silencing him. The SUVs roared away, carrying with them the wreckage of power. The crowd buzzed in disbelief. Social media lit up in real time, and the city itself trembled under the revelation. Still, Marcus remained at the edge of the grave, staring into the hollow earth where Eleanor had nearly been sealed forever. The silence pressed in around him, heavy, suffocating, but alive with a question that would haunt everyone watching. If a man like him hadn't spoken, how many truths would remain buried? The roar of sirens faded, the cemetery emptied, and yet the echoes of that day refused to die. For Marcus Reynolds, the man who had stopped a funeral from becoming a grave, life would never return to what it was. He wasn't just the homeless black man who shouted, "She's not dead." He was the voice that cracked open a billionaire's empire, the witness who forced truth into daylight. In the days that followed, headlines consumed the nation. Charles Whitmore's arrest dominated broadcasts, his empire crumbling as investigators peeled back the layers of fraud, threats, and crimes he had hidden for years. Dr. Langston's confession, trembling and raw, became a haunting reminder of how power preys on fear. And Eleanor's survival, her fragile breath becoming testimony, was proof of just how close the world had come to burying not just a woman, but the truth itself. For Marcus, though, the spotlight was a double-edged sword. Some hailed him as a hero, others dismissed him as lucky. A few still muttered the same word they always had, crazy, because even in vindication, prejudice lingered. That is the quiet cruelty of racism. No matter how loudly you speak the truth, some will always doubt the voice it comes from. Yet something had shifted. People who once passed Marcus without a glance now stopped to listen. Reporters dug into his story, uncovering years of silence, shelters, and shadows. The world began to see what had been invisible, the resilience of a man who carried evidence in his pocket even when he had no roof over his head. Eleanor, recovering in a guarded hospital wing, insisted that Marcus be allowed to visit. Their meeting, quiet and human, did not make the news, but it carried the weight of everything that mattered. She took his hand, calloused, scarred, and trembling, and whispered 2 words, "Thank you." In that moment, Marcus felt something heavier than justice. He felt recognition, the rare gift of being seen. The impact rippled far beyond one man and one city. Whitmore's downfall sparked inquiries into other corporations, other billionaires who believed themselves untouchable. Activists invoked Marcus's name in marches, saying his cry in the cemetery was not just for Eleanor, but for every silenced voice buried by prejudice and greed. "She's not dead," they chanted, turning his desperate words into a rallying cry for truth. And still, Marcus carried the scars. Nights on the street don't fade just because the world finally looks your way. The stares, the whispers, the years of being unseen, they lived in him, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they became proof of his survival, the roots of his strength. As cameras faded and courtrooms filled, one truth remained. It should not take a spectacle for a black man's voice to matter. Marcus had to fight, to shout, to drag the truth out of a grave before anyone listened. That reality is not victory, it is indictment. So here is the question left hanging in the silence of that cemetery, echoing through every viewer's screen. How many truths remain buried because no one dared to listen? How many voices, unheard, are dismissed before they ever speak? Marcus Reynolds stood at the edge of a grave and refused to let silence win. And now the choice rests with us. Do we keep walking past, pretending not to hear, or do we finally stop, turn, and listen? Because sometimes, the most powerful words are not shouted in halls of power or written in gilded books. Sometimes, they come from the margins, carried on the cracked voice of a man the world tried to forget. Words simple, urgent, and undeniable. She's not dead. You've just witnessed a story that was more than shocking. It was a reminder of how deep injustice can run, and how powerful it is when even one voice dares to break the silence. Marcus's words, "She's not dead," were more than a cry in a cemetery. They became a call for truth, for courage, for justice. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Share it, talk about it, and help keep the conversation alive. And if you want more stories like this, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for the next chapter.